Lawmakers in the Indian state of Assam have recently passed a ban on what they consider to be unscientific methods of healing and magic. This includes prayer for healing, which could lead to arrest for those who practice it. Some Christians are concerned that this law is specifically targeting them. It's an attempt to restrict their religious practices and evangelism efforts. Well, joining us with more on Christian persecution in India is President of the Human Rights Education Relief Organization, Jason Jones. He's author of the book, The Great Campaign Against the Great Reset. Jason, at least 2 Christians suffer persecution every day in India. So why is that? And what do you think of this latest proposed law in Assam state?
Well, what we're seeing in India now is a war against Christians, especially the Northeast, the Hill people, the Kuki tribes. In their community, there's not a single church left. In the past year, over 200 churches were burned down. Hundreds of people were killed. Recently, a violent mob of Hindu extremists brutally beat and raped over 20 women and then paraded them through the city naked. So when you're seeing hundreds of churches burned, 70,000 Christians displaced in India, and you have to set that in a world that's on fire. We have in the Philippines now ISIS blowing up churches. In Nigeria, 9 out of 10 martyrs, Christian martyrs in the world this year will be in Nigeria. The Communist Party of China continues to disappear Christian evangelists and Catholic bishops monthly. And it's kind of shocking to a lot of Christians to discover that we often think of Hinduism as a peaceful religion. And when I try to talk to people about the rise of Hindu nationalism and the Hindu extremism in India, people will often giggle and say namaste. But the reality is extremists have been emboldened by this ethno-nationalism. They have this ideology, this extremist ideology that says that to be Hindu is to be Indian is to be Hindu. And so they don't even recognize these communities. And a lot of Christians are surprised, Gary, to discover that there are Christian communities in India that have been there since the 1st century. St. Thomas himself established those communities. So India has a long, rich history with Christians as an integral part of that history. And so it's quite frightening to see the rise of extremism, but these laws that are being passed, the brutality to the Kuki tribes, people who are 90% Christian, I see as a canary in the coal mine for the rest of India.
Well, what do we do about it? I mean, Prime Minister Modi has done nothing to stop this.
No, and he's coddled by Western elites, even Christians. Pope Francis hugged Modi. It's quite sorrowful. We saw the silence of the Western Church when the 1st century Christians in Iraq were being annihilated by ISIS in October. We saw the ancient Christian community, the Armenian Christian community of Artsakh, completely ethnically cleansed, and not a word from the Western Church. What I would like to remind the body of Christ is this. In Paul's letters, he exhorts us to pray and tithe. Over 75% of those exhortations for prayer and tithing was for the persecuted church. And there is no doubt that in the United States today, we wrestle with our own struggles and persecution. But we have to really understand that we are still the freest, most privileged Christians on earth. And as Christians, as members of the body of Christ, if we are not the voice for the Kuki Christian tribes people, if we are not the voice for the Christians rotting away in black prison sites in the CCP, if we're not the voice for the persecuted church in Nigeria, they will have no voice. We cannot count on the New York Times. It's going to be each and every one of us in our churches, asking our communities to pray, to tithe, to remember the persecuted church around the world.
And shifting gears a bit here, Jason, you just returned from a visit to Ukraine. What did you discover there?
Yeah, one of the most shocking discoveries in Ukraine is, and this is not getting a lot of coverage, is that as parts of Ukraine fell to Putin, every evangelical church has been closed. So in the occupied oblasts, in the occupied states of Ukraine, every evangelical church has been closed. And every Catholic church. If it's not a Moscow-aligned Orthodox church, they're closed. So religious freedom is under threat. This is surprising to a lot of folks to discover. Ukraine has the largest pro-life, a very large and active pro-life movement. It's the largest pro-life movement in Europe, and it's the church is on fire in Ukraine. Of the former Soviet republics, it's the most thoroughly Christian of the former Soviet republics. So And we need to continue to pray for the people of Ukraine. And the war has been brutal. I visited a former Soviet prison that was huge. It's just huge former Soviet prison that had been turned into a hospital for the soldiers. And every room in that prison had been turned into a hospital room with at least 2 soldiers missing arms, missing legs, missing eyes. So the longer this war goes on, the more brutality that the people of Ukraine face, the more trafficking that the women of Ukraine will suffer from.
We're
So we
running
need
out
to
of
pray.
time. We're running out of time, but quickly tell us about your book, The Great Campaign Against the Great Reset. Where do you see the U.S. and the world heading? Is this trend toward globalism finished, or is it only a temporary setback?
Well, by God's grace, the trend towards globalism is finished. You know, the Great Reset seeks to obliterate the free institutions of civil society and the intermediary organizations between us and distant, unelected bureaucracies. I was inspired to write this book because for the past 30 years, I live and work in some of the most violent, tragic places in the world. And if you want to know how serious and how brutal this Great Reset is, it's happening. It's happening in Israel and Gaza. It's happening it happened in Iraq. It's happening in China. It's happened in China. It's happening in Ukraine. So it's the Great Reset, behind things that are startling and strange, like you're going to eat cricket meat and love it. You're going to own no property and be happy. You need to know that the ideologues behind this are the very same globalists that are behind some of the greatest catastrophes in the past 50 years.
Okay, I'd like to talk to you more in the future about that. The book is The Great Campaign Against the Great Reset. Jason Jones of the Human Rights Education Relief Organization, thanks for being with us. We appreciate it.
Thank you, Gary.